They weren't made for taste. They were made for toughness. Slapped together before the sun came up, these sandwiches rode in lunch boxes next to black coffee and a busted tape measure. No frills, no garnish, just bread, whatever could stretch, and the silent promise that hunger wouldn't win that day. Not yet. Canned sardines on crackers. You didn't need a stove to make this meal, just a can opener, a stack of saltines, and an empty stomach. Canned sardines on crackers were the kind of dinner you could fix with one hand while the other rubbed the exhaustion out of your face. You peeled back the lid on the tiny tin, briny fish packed tight in oil or mustard sauce, and spooned them straight onto the crackers, one fillet at a time. Some people mashed them. Some ate them whole. Either way, they brought salt, fat, and protein to a plate that didn't have much else. If you had a slice of onion, you added it. If you had a splash of hot sauce, you drizzled. But most nights it was just fish, crackers, and quiet chewing. It wasn't pretty, but it didn't need to be. Sardines didn't apologize for their smell or their shine. They just fed you, fast and full, when the fridge was empty and the pantry echoed. Canned sardines on crackers weren't a delicacy. They were a defense against going to bed hungry. And for a lot of folks, that was more than enough. Fried green tomato sandwiches. When the tomatoes were still hard and green on the vine but couldn't wait any longer, you sliced them thick, dredged them in cornmeal, and dropped them into a hot skillet. They sizzled in bacon grease or lard, browning fast on the outside while the inside softened just enough to bite. The edges crisped, the middle stayed tart, and the smell filled the house with something that felt better than it cost. You laid the hot slices between two pieces of white bread, maybe with a smear of mayo, if there was any left in the jar. Some folks added lettuce. Most just pressed the sandwich together while the tomatoes were still spitting heat and juice. It didn't look fancy, and it didn't last long on the plate. Fried green tomato sandwiches were born from impatience, necessity, and the knowledge that even unripe food had value if you treated it right. In homes where the garden fed the table and the paycheck didn't always arrive, this was a meal that reminded you the backyard could feed you just as well as any grocery store. Fried salt pork with grits. Salt pork was never the main event. It was the seasoning, the edge, the crackle. But if you had a thick slice and some grits to go with it, you had dinner. You sliced the salt pork into thick slabs, tossed them in a hot skillet, and waited until they blistered and curled. The fat rendered out, filling the pan with flavor. While that sizzled, grits simmered on the back burner, slow-cooked, salted just enough, and stirred until they were smooth as cream. When the pork was done, you poured the hot fat into the grits, stirred once, and plated the meat right on top. It was salty, rich, and hot. Grits soaked up every drop, and the pork added just enough chew to remind you there was meat involved. No one left hungry? Not that night. Bread and lard with salt. There was nothing fancier than the way you learned to survive. Bread and lard with salt was survival dressed in simplicity. A thick slice of bread, stale or fresh, it didn't matter, slathered with a cold smear of lard from the tin in the icebox. Not butter, not margarine, just fat. You sprinkled a few grains of salt across the top, ate it slow, ate it fast. Ate it because that was what there was. There wasn't a recipe. There wasn't a debate. It was a meal born of hardship and hardened hands, the kind that didn't ask for flavor as much as it asked for calories. And when it went down, it reminded you, full is full. White gravy and biscuits. Some days all you had was flour, grease, and a few scraps of baking powder to rub together into something that looked like dinner. White gravy and biscuits didn't need anything else. You stirred bacon fat or lard into a bubbling skillet, whisked in flour until it turned the color of toast, and then thinned it with water or milk into a thick, creamy flood of pure, peppery survival. The biscuits didn't need to be pretty, just rough mounds of dough baked until they barely held together, perfect for soaking up every drop of that heavy, salty gravy. It wasn't about indulgence. It was about hunger, about making sure nobody went to bed empty, about knowing that sometimes a plate of bread and sauce was enough to carry you through whatever the world had lined up next. Cold meatloaf sandwiches. Meatloaf always got better the second day, once the fat firmed up and the seasoning settled into every bite. Cold meatloaf sandwiches were about making yesterday's scraps into today's prize. You cut thick slices straight from the fridge, slapped them onto white bread, and squirted a heavy line of mustard across the top. No fancy toasters, no fancy sauces, just meat, bread, and whatever dignity you could scrape together on a Tuesday morning. Sometimes a slice of onion made it into the sandwich. Sometimes just a pickle on the side. Either way, it was sturdy, heavy, and enough to keep you moving until quitting time. Wild game, stew, squirrel, rabbit, etc. When store-bought meat was too expensive and food stamps didn't go far enough, the woods became the butcher. Squirrel, rabbit, even groundhog, or possum, all went into the pot. You cleaned the animal, skinned it, and chopped it into stew-ready pieces, then browned the meat in lard, tossed in chopped onions, a few root vegetables if you had them, and enough water or broth to cover. It simmered for hours, softening the meat and thickening the broth, until it smelled like something you'd been looking forward to all day. Served over cornbread, rice, or just in a bowl by itself, wild game stew was rich, wild, and slightly gamey, flavor that told you this wasn't grocery store food. This was caught, cleaned, and cooked the hard way. It wasn't fancy, but it was real, and it filled the belly like nothing else. Creamed corn sandwich. There was a time when canned creamed corn was everywhere, on tables, in casseroles, poured over biscuits. But one of its lesser-known roles was between bread. 2 slices of white sandwich bread, usually untoasted, soaked up a generous spoonful of cold or room-temperature creamed corn. It oozed out the sides, slippery and bright yellow. The bread went soggy fast, so you had to eat it quick, no dawdling. This wasn't a sandwich made for presentation. It was born from a single can, meant to feed 6 people, spread thin across whatever starch was available. If the corn was warm, it felt like comfort. If it was cold, it was necessity. School kids ate it at lunchtime. Working men ate it while walking to the bus stop. Sometimes it was paired with a slice of tomato or a thin sheet of onion, but even plain, it served its purpose. Fill the belly, don't break the bank. Nowadays, the thought of a corn sandwich might make someone queasy. But then again, most people today haven't stood in front of a cabinet with only 1 can and a loaf of bread and had to make it work. Baked bean sandwiches. You took a can of baked beans, warmed it on the stove, and slapped a scoop onto soft white bread, folded it over, no knife needed, no plate required. The beans were sweet, sticky, and heavy with molasses. The bread soaked it up until it nearly fell apart in your hands. It was messy, it was simple, and it was good. Some folks added onions or mustard. Most didn't. Baked bean sandwiches weren't fancy. They weren't supposed to be. They were just one more way to take a cheap can and stretch it into something that felt like a meal. Cold spaghetti sandwich. Back then, leftovers didn't sit quietly in Tupperware waiting to be forgotten. They got slapped between slices of bread and became tomorrow's lunch. Cold spaghetti, sauce and all, was no exception. You'd take yesterday's noodles, stiff and tangled into little matted clumps, and lay them out across white sandwich bread like some kind of red-smeared haystack. Maybe a shake of Parmesan dusted over the top if you were lucky, or a slice of American cheese to bind it together. Most of the time, though, it was just cold pasta, tomato sauce, and bread. Kids brought it to school wrapped in wax paper. Factory workers ate it in the cab of a truck. It was messy, sure, sauce squeezing out the sides, staining fingers and lunch bags. But it was filling, and it was normal. Nobody flinched. Today it might seem like a joke, the kind of thing you'd see on a food challenge show. But for people living through layoffs, strikes, and months with more bills than paychecks, cold spaghetti sandwiches were just what you did. No shame, no waste, just leftovers turned into fuel. Fried cabbage with bacon grease. A head of cabbage didn't look like much sitting on the counter, but slice it up, throw it in a skillet, slicked with bacon grease, and suddenly it became a dinner that could carry a family. The trick was in the sizzle. You wanted the heat high, the pan loud, and the cabbage brown just enough to turn sweet at the edges. The bacon grease did more than fry. It soaked in, filling every bite with the ghost of meat long gone. Sometimes you added a sliced onion, sometimes a pinch of sugar, but most of the time it was just salt, pepper, and whatever willpower you had left that day. Piled high on a plate beside a heel of bread, fried cabbage was proof that simplicity didn't mean weakness. It meant you knew how to take what you had and make it taste like something worth remembering. Pork neck bones with rice and gravy. They weren't the prettiest cut in the butcher case. Bony, fatty, and full of work. But pork neck bones carried flavor, like nothing else. You browned them hard in a hot pot, fat popping and spitting, then added water or broth and let them simmer slow. The meat clung tight to the bone at first, but after a couple of hours it softened, falling away in rich, tender bites. While the bones worked their magic, you stirred up a pot of white rice and let it sit covered, steam making each grain puff perfect. The gravy was the prize, thickened with flour or just reduced down to a silky, smoky sauce. It got poured heavy over the rice and scattered with bits of meat. No fancy presentation, no cutting required, just spoon after spoon of salty, rich, soul-warming food. Pork neck bones with rice and gravy didn't ask for praise. It just did its job, one bowl at a time. Fried bologna sandwiches. Fried bologna sandwiches didn't pretend to be anything they weren't. You slapped a slice of bologna onto a hot skillet and watched it puff and curl at the edges like a cheap umbrella turning inside out. Sometimes you scored little cuts around the edge to keep it flat. Sometimes you just let it go wild. Either way, you dropped it between two slices of white bread, maybe with a smear of mustard or a scrap of cheese if you had it, and called it dinner. The fat crisped around the edges. The middle stayed juicy and salty. It wasn't pretty, and it didn't last long once it hit your hands. Fried bologna sandwiches were food for the tired, the broke, and the too dang busy to care about anything more than getting something hot and salty into their mouths before collapsing into bed. Cabbage and noodles, haluski. This was old country food brought to the New World's poorest tables. Cabbage and noodles, haluski, if you were raised on it, was butter, starch, and brassica turned into belly-filling gold. You boiled egg noodles soft and set them aside. Meanwhile, a whole head of cabbage, chopped thick, hit a skillet with butter or bacon grease, Fried slow, it browned at the edges, turned sweet, and filled the house with a smell that made your stomach growl. The noodles went back in, everything tossed together until it glistened. Salt, pepper, done. Maybe some onions if you were feeling rich. It wasn't a side dish. It was dinner, and it didn't need to be anything more. Haluski didn't try to prove a point. It just made sure you were fed, and that you'd want more tomorrow. Flour dumplings in tomato juice. When the meat ran out, but the hunger didn't, flour dumplings in tomato juice filled the gap. It started with a pot of cheap tomato juice, poured straight from the can into a dented saucepan, thinned with a little water if you needed to stretch it. You brought the juice to a simmer, bubbling slow, smelling sharp and sour in the warm kitchen. Then came the dumplings, nothing but flour, salt, and a splash of water, stirred into a thick, heavy dough you could scoop up by the spoonful. You dropped rough lumps of dough straight into the boiling tomato broth. They floated up fat and lumpy, soaking in the juice, steaming in the heat. Some folks seasoned the broth with a little black pepper. Some added a dab of bacon grease or a crumbled bouillon cube, if they had one. Most just let it be, simple and sharp, the dumplings soft and chewy against the tangy broth. It wasn't a meal built for joy. It was a meal built to survive. Heavy dumplings, thin broth, and a little heat, enough to trick a growling stomach into silence for one more night. Salt pork and beans. Salt pork and beans was more than a meal. It was a method. You soaked the dried beans overnight, not because it was fancy cooking, but because the beans were stubborn and needed convincing. Come morning, they went into a big pot with slabs of salt pork, fatty, meaty, salty cuts that were closer to preservation than indulgence. As the pot simmered low and slow, the salt pork broke down, melting its flavor into every bean. The smell filled the house and stuck to the walls, thick, smoky, a scent that promised something worth waiting for. You didn't rush it. You let the beans get soft, the broth thicken, and the salt pork turn tender enough to fall apart under your spoon. Some folks added onions, a pinch of sugar, maybe some black pepper or molasses if the cupboard was generous. It came to the table with nothing but a slice of cornbread or white bread to soak up the juices. It wasn't delicate. It was tough, salty, and heavy in the best way. Salt pork and beans didn't just fill a plate. It filled a family, a workday, a week, and in hard times, that meant everything. Brown sugar and butter bread. When money ran out but the need for something sweet didn't, brown sugar and butter bread showed up. It was cheap, fast, and good enough to make the youngest kids smile and the oldest West remember better times. You took a slice of bread, fresh if you had it, stale if you didn't care, and spread it thick with butter, or margarine if real butter was a dream that week. Then you grabbed a handful of brown sugar and sprinkled it heavy over the top, letting it soak into the butter until it turned glossy and wet. Sometimes you toasted it. Sometimes you just ate it straight, the sugar crunching between your teeth, the butter slick and salty against the back of your throat. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't healthy. It wasn't a meal you wrote letters about, but it was sweet. It filled the gap between dinner and bedtime when the real desserts cost too much or didn't exist at all. Brown sugar and butter bread was poor man's candy, Depression-era cake, and a 5-minute reminder that comfort didn't need to come wrapped in a box or bought from a store. It could come from what you already had, and that was enough. Mayonnaise sandwich. It was desperation in its purest form. When the fridge was almost empty and the pantry had been picked clean, the mayonnaise jar was the last soldier standing. A mayonnaise sandwich wasn't dressed up. It didn't pretend. It was 2 slices of plain bread, often drying out at the edges, spread with a slippery pale layer of mayo. Some added black pepper for a hint of life. Others toasted the bread to give it crunch. But the core of it was the same: fat, blandness, and the soft squish of emptiness. Kids often ate it after school while waiting for dinner that might never come. It was a lunchbox filler and a midnight snack when paychecks were still days away. It left the mouth coated and the conscience quiet, because it meant no one was starving, not tonight. And somehow the tang of mayonnaise lingered like a ghost in the kitchen, reminding everyone of the line between getting by and going under. People laughed about it later in life. But in the moment, there was nothing funny. It was a sandwich that meant survival, and survival was sometimes the only victory a family could claim. Hardtack and butter. Hardtack wasn't food you made because you wanted to. It was food you made because you had no other choice. A brick of flour, water, and salt baked until it was dry enough to survive a war. Hardtack lived longer than the people who made it. When there wasn't meat, when there wasn't soup, and when there wasn't even a can of beans left in the pantry, you reached for hardtack. You cracked it open if you were strong enough, softened it in coffee or milk if you weren't, and spread butter, real, rancid, or substitute, over the jagged top to make it something almost edible. The butter soaked into the cracks, softened the chew a little, and gave it a richness that your tongue craved after too many lean meals. Sometimes you dipped it into hot broth to make it manageable. Other times you ate it as it was, dry and dense, grinding it down with tired teeth. Hardtack and butter wasn't dinner for those who wanted luxury. It was dinner for those who understood that a full stomach, even one filled with a meal older than the clothes on your back, was still a blessing worth fighting for. Hominy and salt. Hominy wasn't glamorous. It didn't dress up the plate. It didn't even pretend to be exciting. But it stuck to your ribs, and in a world where food had to work as hard as you did, that was all anyone asked for. You cracked open a big can or boiled dried hominy if you were lucky enough to have the patience. You dumped it into a pot, salted it heavy, and simmered it until the kernels swelled soft and fragrant. Some nights you fried it crisp in bacon grease. Other nights you just ate it as it came, a big steaming bowl of chewy, salty corn. No butter, no pepper, just heat, salt, and stubbornness. It didn't taste like much, but it filled you. It coated your stomach in warmth and starch and got you through the nights when the wind howled too hard and the workday stretched too long. Hominy and salt wasn't a meal you bragged about. It was a meal you remembered because it showed up when nothing else did and when every bite mattered more than anything else in the world. Mock chicken legs, city chicken. It looked like chicken. It tasted close, but there wasn't a feather in sight. Mock chicken legs, better known in factory towns as city chicken, were skewers of pork or veal dressed up to look like something more expensive. You took small cubes of cheap meat, threaded them tight onto wooden skewers, and breaded them like drumsticks. Then you pan-fried them until golden and crisp, finishing in the oven if you had the time. They came out hot, crunchy on the outside, juicy on the inside, and just familiar enough to fool you into thinking you were eating something finer. Served with mashed potatoes, gravy, canned peas, or just a hunk of white bread, city chicken turned a few scraps of meat into a meal that felt special, even when it wasn't. It wasn't about pretending. It was about working with what you had and making it taste like something worth sitting down for. That was the genius behind poor man's cooking. Sweetened condensed milk sandwiches. There were times when there wasn't meat, cheese, or even peanut butter left in the house, but there might be a dusty can of sweetened condensed milk tucked away in the pantry. And if there was, you had yourself dinner. You sliced open 2 pieces of white bread, soft if you were lucky, stale if you weren't, and poured thick, slow ribbons of condensed milk right across the middle. The milk pooled, heavy, glistening, sticky enough to glue the bread together without even trying. You folded the bread closed and bit down fast before it all ran down your wrists. The milk was sweet beyond sweet, dense with sugar and fat, coating your tongue and hitting your stomach like a stone wrapped in velvet. Some folks drizzled extra sugar over the top. Others dusted it with cinnamon or nutmeg if there was anything fancy left in the spice cabinet. But it didn't need it. Sweetened condensed milk sandwiches weren't meals you served with pride. They were meals you served because sugar was calories, and calories were survival. And for a few sticky, glorious minutes, they made the world seem a little softer. Hard-boiled egg and vinegar sandwiches, properly expanded. When the meat was gone and payday was still too far away, you reached for the egg carton and the vinegar bottle. Hard-boiled egg and vinegar sandwiches weren't fancy, but they were fast, cheap, and just good enough to feel like real food. You boiled the eggs hard, no runny yolks, no careful timing. Just a full rolling boil until they were chalky and firm. Peeled them quick, crushed them rough with a fork, and stirred in a heavy splash of vinegar to wake them up. The vinegar made the eggs sing, sharp and clean, cutting through the heavy yolk like a hot knife. You pile the mixture onto slices of bread, sometimes adding a pinch of salt, maybe a crack of pepper if the jar wasn't empty. The bread soaked up the vinegar, softening just enough to hold everything together. It wasn't elegant, but it was rich with flavor and heavy enough to quiet a stomach gnawing from too many lean nights. Hard-boiled egg and vinegar sandwiches didn't pretend to be anything they weren't. They were sour, strong, and stubborn as the people who made them. And every bite carried a promise. You were still standing, and you were still eating. Prune sandwich. Yes, prunes. Those wrinkled little fruit grenades that kids today associate with digestion and old folks. But 50 to 70 years ago, a prune sandwich wasn't weird. It was practical, especially if Grandma had a jar of stewed prunes cooling on the stove. The syrupy sweetness soaked into a piece of soft bread. Then a few soft mashed prunes were spooned on and smashed between the slices. Sometimes butter was added to cut the sweetness, sometimes cinnamon. Often nothing at all. This was sugar when sugar was scarce. It was a child's after-school snack or a quick breakfast for a father running late to the mill. Prunes were affordable, available in bulk, and didn't go bad easily. They were sweet enough to pass as dessert and heavy enough to calm a grumbling stomach. To modernize, it's hard to imagine putting prunes in a sandwich and calling it lunch. But to people who made everything stretch, who preserved fruit in cellars and reused wax paper until it fell apart, it was a small luxury wrapped in practicality, sweet, sticky, and stained into memory. Grits with bacon. Drippings. Grits were the great equalizer. Rich or poor, north or south, if you had a bag of cornmeal and some hot water, you had a meal. But when money got tight and meat disappeared from the table, bacon drippings turned grits into something sacred. You stirred them slow over a low flame, watching the grains swell and thicken into a creamy, soft mound. Then came the real trick, taking a spoonful of saved bacon fat from an old tin by the stove and stirring it in until the whole pot shimmered with flavor. Salted just right, the grits didn't need anything else. But if you had a little shredded cheese, a fried egg, or a bit of leftover meat to throw on top, it became something that felt like a feast, served in chipped bowls or poured into plates and eaten with crusty bread, grits with bacon. Drippings weren't about filling time, they were about filling space. Real food, born from almost nothing, that hugged your ribs and stuck with you all day. Buttered noodles with black pepper. When money got tight and the day was long, buttered noodles with pepper was the meal that answered back. Boil pasta, any kind. Drain it, drop in a stick of butter, or however much was left, and stir until every noodle was coated and shiny. Then hit it with the black pepper. A lot of black pepper. No cheese, no sauce. Just butter, heat, and pepper, sharp enough to make your mouth pay attention. Served in a bowl, eaten with a spoon, and maybe chased with a piece of bread, it didn't pretend to be anything but what it was. Simple, fast, and filling. Exactly what you needed at the end of the kind of day you didn't want to talk about. Cornbread and buttermilk soup. Some nights, you didn't cook. You just poured and stirred. Cornbread and buttermilk soup was a no-fire dinner. Simple, strange, and stubbornly Southern. You crumbled leftover cornbread into a big bowl, chunks, crumbs, whatever you had. Then you poured cold buttermilk over it, just enough to soak the bread and pool around the edges. A spoon did the rest. There was no cooking, no seasoning, just corn, milk, and memory. The flavor was tangy, earthy, and oddly refreshing. It cooled you down in the summer and saved your groceries in the winter. Some folks added salt, others stirred in a little sugar, but most left it alone and just ate. Cornbread and buttermilk wasn't meant to impress. It was a filler, a lifeline, and a legacy all at once. If you grew up on it, it tasted like childhood. If you came to it later, it tasted like surviving without making a fuss. Liver spread on crackers. In houses where nothing got wasted, even the scraps of liver were given new life. Liver spread on crackers was poor man's pâté, rough, strong tasting, but filling enough to make a meal when there wasn't much else around. You started by boiling or frying up the liver, beef, chicken, pork, whatever you could find cheap, until it was cooked through and crumbly. Then you mashed it into a coarse paste with whatever fat you had lying around, bacon drippings, lard, or butter if you were lucky. Salt, pepper, and maybe a pinch of onion powder or garlic made it just palatable enough. You spread it thick onto saltines or old biscuits, stacking them up until the liver filled the gaps between the cracks. It was salty, earthy, and bold, something you ate not because it was delicate, but because it was heavy and stuck with you. Each bite carried the iron tang of survival, a flavor that didn't apologize for its rough edges. You could feed 3 kids and 2 tired adults on a plate of liver spread and crackers. And in those kitchens, that meant success. It was food that came from necessity, dressed up just enough to trick the mind into calling it a meal. Macaroni and tomatoes. There was nothing glamorous about boiled macaroni dumped into a skillet full of canned tomatoes. But when you were broke, it tasted like pure genius. The macaroni soaked up the sharp, sweet tang of the tomatoes, stretching a 50-cent can and a handful of dry noodles into a meal that could feed 3 kids and still have a little left over for tomorrow. Salt, pepper, maybe a knob of butter if you were lucky. That was it. No fancy herbs, no Parmesan showers, just tomatoey, slippery noodles on a chipped plate, steaming in the kitchen while the radio played something soft in the background. Tomato sandwiches with salt and pepper. When the tomatoes came in, you didn't need much else. They were juicy, red, and still warm from the garden. You sliced them thick, laid them on white bread, and sprinkled them with salt and cracked black pepper. Sometimes there was mayonnaise, sometimes not. Either way, When you press that second slice on top, the tomato juice soaked through fast. You ate it leaning over the sink or the counter, wherever was easiest to wipe up the mess. It wasn't a fancy sandwich, but it tasted like summer and survival wrapped up in one. Tomato sandwiches were what you made when the pantry was bare, but the backyard still had something to give. You didn't need sides, silverware, or a story. Just ripe tomatoes, soft bread, and enough time to taste what the sun and soil had managed to produce. In some households, it was all there was for days, but it was enough. Fried raccoon, or opossum, rural South. In some places, meat didn't come from a butcher. It came from the woods, the road, or a trap out back. Raccoon and opossum were greasy, gamey, and tough, but they were protein, and they fed you. You skinned and cleaned the animal carefully, real carefully. Removed the scent glands, trimmed the fat. Parboiled it first to cut the wildness, then fried it in lard with a dusting of flour, salt, and pepper. The meat browned up crisp, smelling stronger than most were used to, served alongside greens, sweet potatoes, or just bread. It was heavy and rich, something you chewed through with your jaw and your pride. In the rural South, this wasn't strange. It was supper. It was resourcefulness. You didn't brag about it, but you didn't waste it either. Mustard sandwiches. 2 slices of bread, a smear of mustard. That was it. But when that was all there was, it was enough. You spread it thick, yellow, and sharp over whatever bread you had, fresh, stale, or halfway to toast. Folded it over, or ate it open-faced, maybe with a shake of salt if you needed more flavor. There was no protein, no side dish, just bite after bite of tang and chew. Mustard sandwiches weren't meals you planned. They were meals that happened when payday didn't. And somehow they carried you to the next one. It wasn't about taste. It was about not giving up. Onion and tomato salad with bread. When the garden was all you had left, you ate what it gave you. And often that meant tomatoes and onions, sharp, juicy, simple. You sliced them thick, the onions biting back tears, the tomatoes bleeding juice all over the counter. Toss them together with salt, pepper, and a drizzle of vinegar or oil if you had it. If not, the juices alone did the work. You laid the mixture onto thick slices of bread, or used the bread to soak up the puddle of juice at the bottom of the bowl. It wasn't salad, the way fancy restaurants talked about salad. It was survival in a bowl, sharp, refreshing, and just heavy enough to remind you you were still standing. Onion and tomato salad with bread wasn't built for presentation. It was built for hot kitchens with fans in the windows and not much else in the icebox. And somehow, on the right summer evening, it tasted like the richest thing in the world. Onion and tomato salad with bread. Sometimes all the garden gave you was onions and tomatoes, and when that happened, you didn't curse it. You built dinner from it. You sliced thick slabs of tomato, the juice running onto the counter, staining everything it touched, peeled and sliced onions so sharp they stung your eyes, tossed both into a big bowl, hit them with a glug of vinegar or oil if there was any to spare, and seasoned with salt and black pepper like you meant it. The bread was day-old, hard around the edges, but you tore it into pieces and let it soak up the juices at the bottom of the bowl. Each bite was a slap of acid, sweet and sharp at the same time, softened by the bread soaking up the life of the vegetables. You didn't set a table for it. You didn't need a knife and fork, just a bowl in your lap, a spoon in your hand, and a hunger that didn't care about fancy cooking. Onion and tomato salad with bread didn't fill you up the way meat would, but it fed something deeper, the memory of sunlight, of dirt under your nails, of survival pulled straight out of stubborn ground. Hot dog and potato hash. It was a scramble, a messy, glorious scramble of chopped hot dogs and diced potatoes fried hard in a big skillet, the potatoes browned and crisped at the edges, the hot dogs split and sizzled, their skins blistering in the heat. Sometimes an onion found its way into the pan. Sometimes a leftover scrap of cheese melted over the top if you had something fancy like that lying around. You piled it onto a plate, doused it with ketchup or mustard if you wanted, and ate standing up at the stove because sitting down took too long. Hot dog and potato hash wasn't a meal you planned. It was a meal you survived, and most nights that was good enough. Ketchup sandwich. This was poverty on white bread, pure and unfiltered. The ketchup sandwich was exactly what it sounds like. Slices of plain bread, often store-brand or homemade, slathered with whatever ketchup was available. Sometimes it was Heinz, but more often it was the cheapest bottle on the shelf or even homemade from surplus tomatoes. This sandwich was the last line of defense between a child and going to bed hungry. It showed up on dinner tables during layoffs, droughts, or long winters when the pantry looked more like a shelf of empty jars than a source of nourishment. Parents told their kids it was just like a burger, just without the meat, and kids played along, licking the tangy sweetness off their fingers. In some households it was toasted to add a bit of crunch, and in others it was folded over to make it feel more like a real sandwich. The ketchup was sugary, acidic, and often watery, but it filled the stomach and added enough flavor to trick the mind into believing it was a meal. There was no pride in it, just resilience. And in a strange way, those who ate it never forgot it. It became a badge of survival, a taste memory tied to struggle, resourcefulness, and the stubborn will to get through another day. Banana and mayonnaise sandwich. In the rural South, it was practically a rite of passage. A ripe banana sliced lengthwise, laid on a thick smear of mayonnaise, and closed inside soft white bread. It sounds like a crime against nature today, but back then it was Saturday lunch, or something a grandmother made with a smile and a wink. The sweetness of the banana met the tang of the mayo, and somehow it worked. Or at least, people told themselves it did. This sandwich was born in kitchens where fruit was rare, and you didn't let anything go brown on the counter. Bananas were a treat, but if you had one, and not much else, mayo and bread made it a meal. It was soft, it was sticky, and it was shockingly filling. Some folks added peanut butter to bridge the gap between sweet and savory. Others swore it needed to be eaten with a glass of milk to wash down the confusion. These days, even mentioning it gets scrunched noses and fake gags. But ask someone who grew up on it, and you'll hear stories, not just about the taste, but about summer days, warm kitchens, and the strange alchemy of poverty and comfort. Onion sandwich. A punch to the tongue and a tear in the eye, the onion sandwich didn't pull any punches. It was the sandwich for the bold, the broke, and the blue-collar men who came home reeking of diesel and smoke. One thick slice of raw onion, preferably yellow or white, slapped between two slices of buttered bread. Sometimes it was salted, sometimes not. No cheese, no meat, just the sting of sulfur and the hope that it would fill the belly. This sandwich showed up in mining towns and railroad camps where hearty flavor mattered more than delicacy. It was a poor man's cure for blandness and a test of who could handle it without blinking. Some folks added vinegar or a splash of oil if they had it, but most didn't bother. It was a meal with bite and character, something to chew on while thinking about overdue bills and how long the winter might last. The onion sandwich didn't try to be likable. It was honest, brutal even, but it worked, and in a time when dignity was often the first thing poverty stole, it offered a strange kind of pride. You ate it, wiped your mouth, and got back to work. Cornmeal fried fish, caught locally. When you couldn't afford the butcher, you went to the river, bluegill, catfish, perch. Whatever bit the line that day went into the skillet. You cleaned them quick, dusted them in seasoned cornmeal, and dropped them into a cast iron pan full of hot oil. They fried fast, crispy on the outside, flaky inside. Served with hush puppies or a scoop of grits, it was a meal born from the water and a little grit. Cornmeal fried fish didn't need sauce. It needed time, a sharp knife, and enough oil to do the job right. When dinner hit the table, it didn't last long. Potato cakes with onion. It started with leftovers, the kind nobody really wanted until you gave them a second life. Cold, mashed potatoes, stiff from the fridge, got dumped into a bowl and mixed with chopped onion, a little flour, maybe an egg if you could spare one. You shaped the mixture into heavy patties and dropped them into a hot skillet, greased with whatever fat was left. The outside crisped golden brown, forming a crust that cracked when your fork hit it. Inside, the potatoes turned creamy again, the onions soft and sweet. You didn't need toppings. No ketchup, no sour cream. Just a stack of hot cakes on a plate and the steam rising to meet you. Some nights they were breakfast, some nights dinner, sometimes both. They didn't last long on the table, and they didn't need help to taste like comfort. Potato cakes with onion reminded you that even the things people thought were done, cold, unwanted, forgotten, could come back better than before. All they needed was a little heat and someone willing to try. Stuffed bell peppers with rice, no meat version. Stuffed peppers without meat sounded like a punishment. But when times got tough, rice stepped up and carried the weight. You boiled up a pot of white rice, soft but not mushy, stirred in diced onions, maybe a spoonful of tomato paste or leftover sauce from the back of the fridge, a sprinkle of salt, pepper, and if the garden was good to you, some chopped herbs or a bit of garlic. You cut the tops off the bell peppers, green, red, whatever was cheapest, and hollowed them out like little bowls, packed them full of rice mix, and stood them upright in a baking dish. A splash of water or tomato sauce at the bottom kept them from drying out. Baked until the peppers softened and the tops crisped just a little, they came out smelling better than anything made from scraps had a right to. No meat, no cheese, just a pepper filled with hope and starch. And sometimes that was the best thing on the table. Boiled potatoes with canned green beans. You started with the potatoes, peeled or not depending on time and preference, boiled them in salted water until they were soft enough to mash with a fork but not falling apart. Then you dumped in a can of green beans, liquid and all, and let everything simmer together for a few minutes. The beans took on the starch of the potatoes. The potatoes took on the salt of the beans. Some folks drained it and served it with butter. Others left it as is, watery and plain, and ladled it out into bowls. It was a no-fuss meal, warm and gentle on the stomach, something to serve the kids when the money had run dry, but dinner still had to happen. It didn't look like much, and it wasn't meant to, but it got the job done. Hot food, fast, and enough for everyone to get seconds. Rice and red beans. Rice and red beans was the meal that stretched for miles. One pot, 2 ingredients, and time. That was all it needed. The beans soaked overnight, softening up for the long boil ahead. Come morning, you'd throw them into a heavy pot with a ham bone, salt pork, or nothing at all if meat was short. Simmered slow, The beans turned creamy and thick. By sundown, they clung to the spoon and carried the scent of something far more expensive than what actually went into the pot. The rice was cheap and dependable, boiled plain and ready to soak up all the flavor. Poured over a pile, the beans made a whole meal out of very little. Some folks added hot sauce, others just spooned it in and leaned back full. Rice and red beans didn't make a scene. It just showed up hot, heavy, and right on time. Fried rice with whatever? Leftovers. Fried rice was never planned. It was built from what got left behind. Cold rice, scraps of meat, half an onion, a spoonful of peas hiding in the back of the freezer. You dumped it all into a hot skillet slicked with bacon, grease, oil, or whatever fat you had. Fried it fast, stirred it hard, scraped the bottom to catch all the crispy bits. If you had an egg, you scrambled it in. If you didn't, you added more rice. Soy sauce was a blessing. Salt and pepper were the usual stand-ins. It didn't matter what went in. The result was always the same. Hot, savory, full of flavor and heat. A spoonful of fried rice filled more than your belly. It filled the gap between not knowing what to cook and making something that felt like real food. And when it was gone, you were full. That was all it had to be. Sugar sandwich. It was the kind of thing whispered about in lunchrooms, but devoured in the privacy of a dim kitchen. Just a slice of white bread, cheap, soft, and without character, smeared with margarine, then sprinkled generously with white sugar. Sometimes the bread was folded in half, like a taco. Other times, stacked with another slice to mimic the real thing. In homes where meat was a luxury and cereal was a Sunday-only treat, the sugar sandwich became a last resort, a dessert, or even breakfast. The margarine, often from a government-issued block or a tub of oleo, would soften into the crumb of the bread, creating a greasy glue that held the sugar in place. Every bite crunched with the sound of crystals grinding against teeth, and for a few seconds the world didn't seem quite so empty. This sandwich came alive, especially during the early mornings before school or late at night when dinner was missed or stretched too thin. It was a favorite among children who didn't know any better, and a quiet shame for parents who wished they could give more, but it also tasted like stolen joy, a cheap thrill in a world where there weren't many. Canned tamale pie. It came out of a box, a can, or a desperate idea, and sometimes all three. Canned tamale pie was the last-minute hero of dinner tables that had more mouths than money. You browned what little ground beef you had, stirred in a can of corn, a can of tomatoes or chili beans, and maybe a dash of cumin or chili powder if the spice rack wasn't empty. That mixture went into a baking dish, bubbling and loud. Then came the topping, boxed cornbread mix, poured right over the top, thick enough to seal it in and fluffy enough to make it feel special. Baked until golden on top and steaming at the edges, tamale pie sliced like a casserole and ate like a hot meal should. Fast, easy, and filling. No one asked what kind of meat was in it. No one complained it wasn't real tamales. They just ate it, smiled, and came back for seconds. Egg drop soup with scraps. This wasn't a recipe, it was a last stand. When all you had was a broth base, a couple vegetables, and one egg, you made egg drop soup. Water and bouillon made the broth. Maybe there was a real chicken carcass left from Sunday. More often, it was just hot, salty liquid with a few scraps of onion, celery, or carrots tossed in from the back of the icebox. The egg was the magic. Whisked in a bowl, then poured slowly into the boiling broth while stirring, it turned into silky ribbons that swirled around like something elegant. A dash of pepper gave it bite. A little vinegar or soy sauce if someone had traveled far enough to pick some up. Served in mugs or soup bowls or whatever was clean, it didn't look like much. But it was warm, nourishing, and felt, just for a moment, like a real meal. And sometimes that moment was enough. Tomato sandwich. When the tomatoes were ripe and falling off the vine faster than they could be canned, the tomato sandwich reigned supreme. Thick, juicy slices of homegrown tomato, deep red and bursting with flavor, were laid across soft bread smeared with mayonnaise or butter. Salt and pepper crowned the top. That was it. It didn't pretend to be anything fancy. But in the heat of a southern summer, with sweat dripping and sunburn setting in, nothing tasted more alive. The tomato sandwich was seasonal salvation. It was the joy of growing your own food, the pride of a backyard garden feeding a family of 7. Kids came in from chores with sunburnt arms and dirt under their nails, and this was what waited on the table. Soggy bread, red juice running down fingers, the tang of salt and acid on the tongue. It was messy and marvelous. When meat was too expensive and store trips were rare, this sandwich filled the gap. It was cheap, abundant, and for a brief moment in August, tasted like luxury. People remembered it long after they could afford more. Fried bologna sandwich. If you grew up poor in mid-century America, chances are you've heard the sputter of bologna hitting a hot, greasy pan. It would curl up at the edges like a tiny hat, the middle bubbling like a drum. Fried bologna wasn't glamorous, but it was the next best thing to steak for families counting every dime. It came in giant pink tubes from the deli counter or discount bins, sliced thick or thin, depending on how generous the grocer was feeling that day. You'd toss it into a skillet with a bit of leftover bacon grease or lard, slap it between 2 pieces of white bread, sometimes toasted if the stove was already hot, and maybe dress it with a smear of mustard or a slice of government cheese if you were feeling rich. In steel towns, mining camps, and inner cities alike, this sandwich became a staple of factory lunch pails and after-school snacks. The smell of sizzling bologna was unmistakable, salty, greasy, mouth-watering. In a way only hunger can exaggerate. It didn't need lettuce or artisan buns. It needed heat, bread, and the willingness to pretend you were eating something better. And often it was, because it tasted like home, like making do, like being fed by someone who loved you enough to get creative with very little. Scalloped potatoes and onions. There wasn't a casserole dish in town that hadn't seen scalloped potatoes and onions. It was a staple, simple, cheap, and stretched so far it might as well have been elastic. You sliced the potatoes thin, real thin. Onions, too, layered them in a buttered pan with a little salt, maybe a sprinkle of flour between each level, and poured watered-down milk or canned evaporated milk over the whole thing. Baked low and slow, the top turned golden and crusty, while the bottom simmered into a soft, starchy comfort. No cheese, no cream, just patience. You pulled it out when the edges bubbled and the smell filled the kitchen. Rich, savory, and just a little sweet from the onions. It was dinner by itself, or a side to stretch out a lonely pork chop or a spoonful of beans. Scalloped potatoes and onions didn't claim to be a feast, but it was hot, filling, and could feed 6 people with 3 potatoes. In a house where the lights flickered and the fridge echoed, that made it royalty. Oxtail stew with vegetables. Oxtail wasn't for the faint of heart or the short on time. It was bony, gristly, and cheap. But if you knew what you were doing, It turned into the richest stew on the stove. You browned the pieces first, fat crackling in the pan, then dropped them into a big pot with water, onions, garlic, and whatever root vegetables hadn't gone soft yet, carrots, turnips, potatoes. It simmered for hours. The meat slowly pulled from the bone, melting into the broth until it turned thick, savory, and dark as leather. The marrow gave it weight. The vegetables gave it sweetness. The thyme gave it magic. By the end, there wasn't a person at the table who wasn't wiping their bowl clean with bread or fingers. Oxtail stew was proof that patience pays off, even if you started with nothing but bones. Bologna boats with melted cheese. If you were hungry and broke and had 5 minutes to get dinner on the table, Bologna boats had your back. You started with thick-cut slices of bologna, the cheaper, the better, laid flat on a baking sheet. Once they hit the heat, the edges curled up into little bowls, perfect for holding whatever scraps you had. Most nights it was just a scoop of shredded cheese, cheddar, American, or even broken up slices from a crumpled wrapper. You dropped it right in the middle and let it melt until it bubbled and browned, the fat from the bologna sizzling into the tray. If you had crushed crackers, leftover mashed potatoes, or a dollop of mustard, those went in too. But even plain, the smell was enough to bring the whole house to the kitchen. Served with a spoonful of slaw, canned green beans, or nothing at all, Bologna boats didn't apologize for what they were. They were salty, greasy, and full of character. Dinner on a dime, comfort without credentials. And when you took that first bite, crunchy edges and molten center, you didn't care how much money you didn't have. It just tasted good. Boiled potatoes with butter and onions. If you had potatoes, you had dinner. Boil them whole or chopped, skins on or off, whatever time and energy allowed. Melt butter in a pan. Fry up a chopped onion until it went soft and golden. Drain the potatoes, throw them in, smash them gently with a fork, and let them soak up everything. Some folks added salt, others added pepper. A few tossed in whatever herbs were growing wild out back. Served hot, it was a one-pan meal that smelled like home and tasted like you were doing okay, even when the cupboards told a different story. Cabbage and potato soup. You didn't need much to make cabbage and potato soup. Just a pot, a flame, and the will to keep moving. You peeled and chopped the potatoes, rough and quick. Then came the cabbage, shredded by hand or knife into thick, wrinkled strips. You dropped everything into a big pot of salted water or thin broth. Let it boil until the cabbage softened and the potatoes cracked open just enough to cloud the liquid. Onion, if you had it. A clove of garlic, if you were lucky. But the heart of it was always the same. A cheap, honest meal that filled a bowl and stuck to your ribs. Served with stale bread or nothing at all, cabbage and potato soup reminded you that the line between survival and comfort was thinner than people think. It didn't win awards. It didn't need seasoning secrets. It just needed to be hot, heavy, and ready by the time the sun went down. Boiled eggs and toast. You boiled the eggs hard. No soft yolks, no fancy techniques. Just a rolling pot of water and a handful of eggs, cooked until they were solid through. You peeled them at the table, steam rising from your fingertips. Slice them, or mash them right onto toasted bread, maybe with a dab of mustard or a shake of salt if the day had gone well. Sometimes there was butter. Most times just dry toast and the egg to carry it. It was quiet food, the kind you ate with your head down, not because you were ashamed, but because you were too tired to talk. Boiled eggs and toast didn't fill the house with the smell of dinner. It didn't need to. It just filled the body and gave you enough to get through the rest of the night. Simple, soft and steady. That was the power in it. Mashed potato pancakes. Leftover mashed potatoes weren't thrown out. They were transformed. Mashed potato pancakes were second-day salvation, a meal built from scraps that tasted better than most things made fresh. You started with cold, stiff mashed potatoes, lumpy, buttery, maybe a little dry. Stir in an egg if you had one, a spoonful of flour, and a pinch of salt. Some folks added chopped onions. Others tossed in a handful of cheese or herbs when they were lucky. You formed the mixture into thick, heavy patties and laid them into a hot, greased skillet. The outside crisped up golden and crackly, while the inside stayed soft and creamy. The smell alone was enough to pull kids to the kitchen like a dinner bell. No need for sides, just a stack of hot cakes, maybe a dab of sour cream or a shake of pepper on top. They were cheap, filling, and made from nothing new. But when your fork cracked through that crust into the steaming middle, it didn't feel like leftovers. It felt like a quiet little miracle. Dried apple and rice bake. This was a pantry dish, built from things that didn't go bad, even when everything else did. You boiled rice until tender, then folded in a handful of dried apples, chopped rough, a little sugar, a bit of cinnamon, and a spoonful of lard or butter turned it into something that almost felt like dessert. You poured it into a baking dish, baked it until the top set and the apples softened, then spooned it into bowls while it was still warm. It wasn't a flashy meal. It was quiet, simple, and sweet in a way that stuck with you. Dried apple and rice bake was what you made when you wanted comfort, but the store was too far, and the money was too short. And when you sat down to eat it, spoon in hand, it tasted like home. Rice pudding as dinner. When meat ran out and vegetables were too expensive, rice pudding stepped in, sweet, heavy, and warm. It was one of the few dinners that felt like a treat when you had nothing left to treat yourself with. You boiled white rice until soft, then stirred in milk, sugar, and maybe a pinch of salt. If the cupboards were kind, you added cinnamon or a handful of raisins. If they weren't, you made do. You let the mixture simmer low until it thickened into a creamy, sticky comfort, something between a dessert and a survival plan. Sometimes an egg went in to make it richer. Most times it didn't. You spooned it into bowls and ate it slow, letting the warmth settle into your bones. Rice pudding didn't care that it was dinner. It just did the job, filling you up with something soft, sweet, and simple enough to remind you there was still goodness in the world. And when you scraped the bottom of the pot, you didn't feel cheated. You felt full. Milk toast, bread, and hot milk. There was nothing fancy about milk toast. It was the kind of meal you made when your body needed warmth and your wallet was empty. It started with stale bread, soft white slices that had seen better days. You toasted them lightly if the stove worked, or just tore them into pieces if it didn't. Meanwhile, you warmed a pan of milk, whole if you had it, watered down if you didn't, stirring slow so it wouldn't scorch. A pinch of salt, maybe a dab of butter, or a shake of sugar, depending on what kind of night it had been. Once the milk was hot, you poured it straight over the bread in a bowl, letting it soak in and soften everything until it was more comfort than food. It was quiet, it was plain, and it went down easy. For sick days, end-of-month nights, or just when there wasn't much else to eat, milk toast did the job. It warmed your hands, it calmed your stomach, and it reminded you that sometimes survival didn't look like a feast. It looked like a bowl of hot milk poured over bread, and that was good enough. Apple cider vinegar stew. This was depression food, sour, simple, and stronger than it looked. Apple cider vinegar stew started with whatever root vegetables you had, potatoes, onions, carrots. You peeled what needed peeling, chopped it all coarse, and threw it into a pot with water and a splash of cider vinegar. The vinegar cut through everything, brought brightness to the broth, and made up for the absence of meat. Sometimes there was a scrap of bacon or salt pork. Sometimes just a bay leaf or a clove of garlic. Most of the time it was the vegetables, the vinegar, and a long boil that made it something worth eating. You served it hot, ladled into bowls, and eaten with a spoon scraped across the bottom. It wasn't rich, but it was honest. It woke up your tongue, warmed your stomach, and reminded you that a little bite could be a blessing.